let me start by hopefully piquing your interest a little bit. Are you a coach for any kind of sport? Maybe you're a trainer, or maybe you've just tried to help your friend get better at some sort of skill. Without being aware of it, you're constantly involving qualitative biomechanics in your coaching or in your training. And so, what we're learning this week is useful for many reasons. Not only does it help us improve coaching, but it also helps reduce the risk of injuries and provide better feedback when we're evaluating someone's movement or someone's performance. So, by the end of this lecture video, we will have learned about the difference between qualitative and quantitative biomechanics and learn about different movement and skill definitions. Yes, a little bit more definitions. So today we're talking all about movement analysis. So first, we need to understand what analysis actually means. So basically, analysis means breaking something down, like a basketball free throw, into these smaller parts so that you can examine each of these smaller parts individually. So here you could analyze the arm position, the height of the ball when it leaves the player's hands, the velocity at which the ball left the hands, the distance from the net, etc. That's all part of what we call movement analysis. Now, there are two ways for us to analyze movements in biomechanics. We can do it either quantitatively or qualitatively. And this week, we're focusing on qualitative biomechanics. And then for the rest of the term, we'll talk about quantitative biomechanics. So essentially, in a quantitative analysis, the data are quantified or they're measured and they're described with numbers. This type of analysis requires equipment to record and measure the movements. And for this reason, it's usually used by biomechanists or trained technicians. Now, on the other hand, in a qualitative analysis, you literally qualitatively examine the elements of the motion or the skill. So you use comparative descriptors like faster, slower, higher, lower, longer, those sorts of terms to describe the characteristics of the skill. Visual observation is the basis and the essence for most qualitative analyses. So it'd be difficult to conduct a qualitative analysis without actually observing the individual as they're completing the skill. And this type of analysis, this qualitative analysis, is usually used by coaches and trainers, like I said. Okay, just a few definitions that are important when we're talking about movement analysis. So the first one is a movement pattern. It's a general series of anatomical movements that have common elements of spatial configuration. So an example of a movement pattern would be jumping. Now, one step further than that, a skill is a movement pattern, but it's for a particular task. So if our movement pattern is jumping, then an example of a skill in jumping would be the high jump skill. So it's still this sort of jumping movement pattern, but it's for a particular or a specific task, that is the high jump. Next, we have a technique. So it's a particular type of skill execution. So again, if we're thinking of the high jump, well, the flop is a specific technique that people use when they're executing that high jump skill. So if you watched the Olympics in the summertime, you would have seen a lot of this. And the last one is style, which is really just individual adaptation. So your own individual or personal approach to the technique or the skill that you're executing. So it's important to understand the sort of difference between these four terms. Okay, so next we have a difference between a closed and an open skill. So a closed skill would be done in this predictable environment. So you're free to execute the skill without having to make any sort of quick decisions. So an example of a closed skill would be a squat that's done in a squat rack at the gym. It's a predictable environment. There are no sort of surprises coming at you. You're free to just execute the squat as you think it. Now, the opposite of that is an open skill, where the skill is performed in response to changes in the environment. So now you're in an unpredictable environment. And in this case, decision making and response time may be more important than the actual biomechanical features of that skill. So an open skill would be any sort of like game situation. If you're playing soccer and you're going to kick the ball, all of a sudden the opponent is coming at you. You have to make these quick decisions about how you're going to execute that skill. And maybe a really clear contrasting example would be running. So a closed skill would be running on a treadmill, whereas an open skill would be running outside, right? Outdoors, there's many unpredictable features. You may have to adjust the way you're running depending on the environment, whereas running on a treadmill, it's a closed environment, very predictable. Okay, next we have discrete and continuous. So a discrete skill has a definite beginning and end, and it can be easily broken down into different phases, whereas a continuous skill has no specific beginning or end. So you may just randomly select these start and stop points. It's kind of arbitrary. So an example of a discrete skill could be something like throwing a ball. There's a very clear start and end to when you're throwing a ball. Whereas a continuous skill may be something like swimming or running, where you just sort of like decide to start and stop. So I encourage you now I gave you some examples, but maybe you should try to come up with your own examples and write those down for each of these definitions. Okay, so that's it for this first video. Just to quickly recap, we learned about the difference between qualitative and quantitative biomechanics, and we're now familiar with different movement and skill definitions. What we learned in this video will serve as the basis for the next video, where we actually get into the steps of qualitatively evaluating movement. So I'll see you there.